When you hear the word dungeon, you probably imagine a damp stone corridor, lit dimly by flickering torches, echoing with the clink of iron chains and the moans of forgotten prisoners. But the real origins of medieval dungeons are far more mundane and deeply bureaucratic than the stories would suggest. Before they became chambers of horror, dungeons were, at first, practical rooms, storage spaces, cellars, cold, sunken rooms that were never meant to hold people, just barrels, tools, and supplies. The very word, dungeon, comes from the French word donjon, which originally meant the main tower or keep of a castle, the most secure and fortified part. This tower was often used as a last line of defense in a siege, a refuge, and a symbol of a lord's dominance. But eventually, the darkest chambers beneath the donjon, those inconvenient, unused, or otherwise unpleasant places, started being used for something else, locking people away. Not because it was strategic, but because it was easy. The rooms were already cold, dark, and unpleasant. Why not throw a troublesome enemy down there? In early medieval Europe, especially during the 10th and 11th centuries, justice was personal and violent. Lords had private armies, personal vendettas, and their own small castles scattered across feudal lands. If someone angered you, stole your grain, insulted your daughter, refused to pay taxes, you might not kill them outright. You'd toss them in your cellar. There were no centralized prisons, no police, just your authority and a key. And so these subterranean rooms evolved. First they were storage. Then they were holding pens. And eventually, they became an unofficial form of imprisonment. They weren't part of some grand design. They were improvised, and that made them worse. There were no blueprints, no standards, no sense of humane treatment, just rock, darkness, and isolation. The early dungeon didn't look like a theatrical set. There were no torch-lit corridors, or manacles on the walls, at least not yet. The first real dungeons were just holes. Pits. Sometimes they were literally vertical shafts dug into the earth beneath a keep. These were called oubliettes from the French oublier, meaning, to forget. That was the point. You threw someone in, and you left them there. No ladder. No light. Just stone and silence. It was the medieval equivalent of erasing someone. What's terrifying about oubliettes is that they weren't designed to kill someone quickly. They were designed to make you vanish slowly. Starvation could take days, even weeks. The prisoner would sit, stand, or lie in their own filth. They couldn't move. Couldn't stretch. Couldn't scream loud enough to be heard beyond the stone. It wasn't just death, it was isolation, dehumanization, and a quiet descent into madness. By the 12th and 13th centuries, as kingdoms grew and monarchs began consolidating power, dungeons became more formalized. Castles weren't just defensive strongholds, they were centers of administration, law, and punishment. The dungeon became a symbol, not just of suffering, but of the authority to cause suffering. Kings, barons, and bishops all kept dungeons. Some were in castles, others in town halls, and some in monasteries. Yes, even monks had their own cells for wayward souls. These dungeons were often underground, sometimes accessible by a narrow winding staircase or a hidden trapdoor. They were placed below the kitchens, the wine cellar, or directly beneath the central keep. That placement wasn't an accident, it was intentional. It kept the prisoner out of sight, and more importantly, out of mind. The dungeon's location reminded everyone, power rested above, and suffering festered below. We tend to imagine dungeons as places for criminals, but in many cases, they weren't. A dungeon wasn't used the way we use a jail today. You weren't sentenced to 10 years in a dungeon. That would have been a mercy. Instead, you were held indefinitely, while awaiting trial, ransom, confession, or death. There was no clear end point. No parole board. Just the whim of your captor. Some prisoners were politically inconvenient, nobles fallen out of favor, claimants to thrones, or captured enemies. Others were local troublemakers, a loud peasant, a merchant in debt, or someone who owed taxes and couldn't pay. Being in a dungeon didn't mean you were guilty. It meant you were unlucky. And punishment wasn't always the point. Sometimes it was about leverage. A baron might keep your son in a dungeon until you paid a tribute. A bishop might lock you up until you confessed to a heresy. Dungeons were used like pawns on a chessboard, silent, suffering leverage. What made early dungeons so particularly dreadful wasn't their cruelty. It was their indifference. They weren't designed with suffering in mind. They just happened to be places where suffering occurred, and no one cared to stop it. Over time, that neglect became normalized. Then it became institutionalized. And finally, it became expected. By the late Middle Ages, dungeon suffering became almost ceremonial. It was built into the process of punishment. You didn't just lock someone away, you humiliated them. You broke them. You let them rot beneath the very floors, where nobility dined, laughed, and drank. That juxtaposition was not lost on anyone. Dungeons were reminders that power could pluck anyone from the sunlight and toss them into darkness, no trial necessary. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine knights and castles, banners and tournaments. But beneath every grand castle, there was almost always a pit, a hole, a dark space where people were locked and left to fade away. Not because they were evil, but because they were inconvenient. That was the real purpose of the dungeon, not to hold justice, but to bury problems. So, the next time you picture a dungeon, don't think of torch-lit corridors, or stone walls lined with shackles. Think of a cellar. Cold. Quiet. Not designed for people, but used on them anyway. A place meant for wine and wheat that instead held lives, slowly disappearing in the dark. In the medieval world, power was not just about gold, land, or armies. It was also about fear. The ability to instill it. To use it without ever drawing a sword. And perhaps nothing embodied that silent threat more completely than the presence of a dungeon. Not just a space beneath a castle, but an idea. A warning. A whisper that said, "Step out of line, and you vanish." By the 12th century, castles weren't just military fortresses. They were political stages. The layout of a castle sent a message. The high towers, the defensive walls, the guarded gathouses, they all declared control and dominance. But it was what lay beneath the stones, underfoot and out of sight, that truly completed the architecture of fear. Dungeons transitioned from improvised storage pits into intentional spaces. Spaces built with permanence in mind. The stone became thicker. The doors heavier. The bolts stronger. Rooms were designed to be lightless, soundless, and escape-proof. Not because they had to be, but because they sent a message. That message was clear to anyone who saw a prisoner dragged through the courtyard and down into the ground. The Lord had complete control, not just over your life, but over your very presence. Tales of dungeons began to circulate not just in towns, but in the minds of the people. Even those who had never seen one knew what it meant to be taken to one. The fear of the dungeon worked better than any guard. Nobles learned that they didn't always need to kill to silence a critic or discourage defiance. All they needed was a door that locked behind someone and didn't open again. Lords and kings began to use dungeons as a theatrical statement. Some held prisoners in public view before moving them underground. Others made a spectacle of locking people away, parading the condemned through streets before disappearing them into stone. It became a tool of psychological warfare. A rumor would spread that a merchant angered the tax collector, or that a knight defied the king's command. Days later, they were gone. Everyone would look at the gate of the keep and wonder who would vanish next. The dungeon became more than just a punishment, it was a sentence in itself. No explanation needed. No paperwork. You could walk through a lord's hall, and see nothing amiss. But beneath it voices cried out, unheard. Dungeons were the dark echo of absolute authority. The hidden hand that reinforced every command, every tax, every decree. This power dynamic wasn't just used on peasants and criminals. It extended to nobles, clergy, and even royalty. Castles like the Tower of London became infamous, not for the battles fought outside, but for the secrets kept inside. When a king wanted to remove a rival without risking a rebellion, he didn't send an army. He sent a letter. The accused would arrive, be escorted politely through the halls, and then disappear. Into the walls. Into the dark. Terror was the language of power. And the dungeon was its punctuation. Sometimes whispered about in markets. Sometimes used as a threat by petty officials. Complain again, they might say, and you'll see the inside of the walls. Everyone knew what that meant, even if they'd never seen it. For a peasant or merchant, the dungeon was an abstract horror, a place you hoped to never know. But for those inside the castle walls, servants, guards, squires, it was real. They had seen the heavy keys, heard the doors thud shut, smelled the damp stone. Those details made it worse, because they were reminders that this wasn't just a story. It was a function of their daily life, and it could easily become their fate. Even the architecture began to reflect the fear. Some castles had their dungeons deliberately placed beneath the banquet hall. While nobles feasted and music played, the groans of the imprisoned echoed faintly below. It was symbolic. A message from the Lord to every guest: I dine above your suffering. Religious leaders were not exempt from this performance of authority. Monasteries, though devoted to prayer and reflection, also maintained holding cells. And the church used dungeon-like cells for heretics and dissenters. Especially during inquisitions. A person could be accused of thought, of speech, of not kneeling at the right time. And the church, too, had dark places to hold them. The fear of the dungeon bled into art and literature. Chronicles from the period make subtle references to people being put away or taken below. They rarely go into detail, because they didn't need to. Everyone understood. The absence of a neighbor. The closed door of a lord's tower. The jingling keys at a guard's side. These were enough. The dread was ambient. Constant. Over time, even the idea of a dungeon expanded in scope. It didn't just mean a dark cell. It meant the possibility of an ending silence. A life removed from the world. Stripped of identity, of voice, of light. Lords came to rely on this more than violence. It kept people in line. No blood had to be spilled. Just a shadow across a door. And so, medieval dungeons became tools not just of punishment, but of politics. They were the quietest form of censorship. The most efficient method of removing a problem without creating a martyr. The fear of torture was secondary. The real horror was the idea of being forgotten. Unrecorded. Lost in the dark while life went on above. In this way, the dungeon became more powerful than any sword. It didn't need to kill. It only needed to exist. And to remind everyone, rich or poor, guilty or innocent, that those in power controlled not just the castle, but your place in the world. Or your absence from it. If you ever stood in a real medieval dungeon, the first thing you'd notice isn't the chains. It isn't the smell. It's the temperature. The chill creeps into your bones before your eyes can even adjust to the dark. It's the kind of cold that doesn't come from winter air, but from deep stone. From a silence that has lasted for centuries. A cold that doesn't fade with a coat or a fire, because fires weren't meant to burn here. This wasn't a place for warmth. It was a place for forgetting. Medieval architects didn't design dungeons with comfort in mind. In fact, many weren't designed at all. They were repurposed, unused basements, undercrofts, wine cellars, old cisterns. If it was dark, sunken, and hard to reach, it could become a dungeon. The very randomness of the construction added to the terror. There was no standard layout. No blueprint. No two dungeons were exactly the same. That unpredictability was part of the cruelty. Some were simple holes in the ground, dug out and reinforced with stone. Others were small rooms with no windows, only a thick wooden door reinforced with iron. But what they all shared was isolation. The walls were thick, often several feet of stone. Sound couldn't travel. Light didn't find its way in. If you screamed, you might hear your own voice echo, but that was all. No one was listening. That was by design. Many dungeons were underground, sometimes beneath 5 or 6 layers of flooring, storage, and earth. Ventilation was poor or non-existent. Water seeped in from the stone, collecting in puddles. The air grew damp and stale, thick with mold, rot, and the exhaled breath of the forgotten. In some places, the walls would sweat, a constant dampness that never dried. Clothing clung to skin. Skin broke down. Rashes, sores, and infections were almost guaranteed. Flooring was often bare rock or uneven dirt. In wealthier castles, there might be a layer of straw, though that straw quickly became soaked with urine, blood, and filth. There were no toilets, only a bucket, if you were lucky. More often, prisoners were left to relieve themselves where they sat or lay. Over days or weeks, the dungeon filled with the pungent stench of human waste, the decay of abandoned food, and the breath of the dying. Doors were massive and heavy, constructed of thick oak or chestnut, bound with iron straps and sealed with bolts. These were not doors that opened easily. They creaked with protest. They slammed shut like the closing of a tomb. Guards held the only key, and even they approached the door with caution. Once locked, that door became more than wood, it became a verdict. A boundary between the world above and the world below. Between the living and the forgotten. Windows, if they existed at all, were no larger than a hand. Slits carved into the stone, sometimes angled upward to let in a shaft of dim, indirect light. More often, the only source of illumination was the occasional torch held by a passing guard, or nothing at all. Imagine days without light. Then weeks. Time became meaningless. Night and day blurred. Some prisoners forgot the names of the seasons. Some forgot their own names. Moisture in the walls bred moss and mold. Fungus crept up the stone like slow green veins. Rats nested in the corners, gnawing at scraps, sometimes even the soft flesh of those too weak to move. Insects bred in the straw. Lice and fleas lived on the prisoners. They bit constantly. Itching became ceaseless. Skin broke open, bled, scabbed, reopened. It was a slow disintegration of the human body. And it all happened quietly. The ceilings were low. Some so low you had to crouch. Others forced prisoners to sit or lie down permanently. Standing for too long was impossible. Stretching was out of the question. Your muscles shrank. Your posture warped. Your body turned inward on itself. Bones atched. Joints locked. Some prisoners emerged permanently hunched, their spines curved like old roots. Others never emerged at all. Chains were embedded in the walls or the floor. Not just for restraint, but to prevent even the illusion of freedom. Shackles bound ankles, wrists, even necks. Some were tight. Others too loose, causing chafing, bleeding, and slow, steady bruising. Prisoners couldn't walk. Some couldn't even sit upright. Their world became a 5-foot radius. A circle of stone, rope, and misery. And still, all of this was considered normal. Expected. The dungeon was not a place for reform, or justice, or even vengeance. It was a dumping ground for the inconvenient. Its construction mirrored its purpose. It was built to break, not quickly, not violently, but gradually. To wear down the body, then the mind, until all that was left was a quiet, compliant silence. The architecture didn't just contain the prisoner. It consumed them. So the next time someone speaks of dungeons with romantic curiosity, think of the stone. The water dripping. The body curled on the floor. The walls that do not echo, because sound has no one to reach. The cold that comes not from weather, but from intention. These were not accidents. They were messages. And their message was clear: here, you are no longer a person. You are a problem. And you are being erased. There is a very particular silence that lives in a medieval dungeon. It is not the peaceful kind. Not the silence of a still forest, or the quiet of a room after everyone has gone to sleep. It is the silence of stone. A silence that pushes in on you from every side. Thick, pressing, and permanent. A silence so deep that even your own breath feels too loud. So quiet that the sound of a single drop of water echoes like a hammer strike. And with the silence came the dark. Not just dimness, but total, devouring darkness. In most medieval dungeons, there were no torches on the walls. No lamps. No gentle sunlight filtering in from a crack above. Just a void. The kind of blackness that made you question if your eyes were even open. The kind that swallowed the days. That erased faces. That made you forget what light even looked like. For the prisoner, this was not just uncomfortable. It was disorienting. It was maddening. After a few days in darkness, the mind begins to break. You lose track of time. Your body's internal rhythms drift. You sleep too much, or not at all. You dream while awake. You hallucinate. You begin to hear things that are not there. Footsteps, voices, whispering winds that never existed. Some prisoners screamed until their voices gave out. Others fell into eerie silence and never spoke again. In some dungeons, the air itself was a form of torture. There were no windows. No vents. The only exchange of air came when a guard opened the heavy door. And sometimes, days would pass before that happened. The oxygen grew thin. The air turned stale and heavy. Every breath became an effort. The prisoner might feel their chest tighten, their head grow light. And still, the door would not open. The dungeon did not care. It simply existed. And waited. Sensory deprivation wasn't always intentional at first. But as lords and torturers came to understand its effects, they began to use it deliberately. Darkness became a tool. Isolation became a strategy. Dungeons were sealed tighter. Openings were reduced. Some chambers were even dug deeper into the earth to guarantee silence. Others had no doors at all, only trapdoors from above, which were closed as soon as the prisoner was dropped in. There was no need to speak. No need to threaten. The darkness did the work for them. Some prisoners were left alone for weeks. Others, months. Their eyes adjusted to nothing. Their ears reached out in desperation for the slightest sound. A mouse scuttling across the floor became a moment of connection. A drop of water became a cruel metronome, reminding them of every second they'd been trapped. And when, finally, someone did arrive, the burst of torchlight was blinding. Painful. Some screamed. Others wept. The return of light was not relief. It was another shock to a mind already fraying. The deprivation extended beyond the body. It ate away at memory. Prisoners forgot the shape of their loved ones' faces. Forgot what the sky looked like. Forgot the color of grass. Time slowed to a crawl. Hours passed like days. Days passed like weeks. Some kept track of time by scratching the wall. Others gave up entirely. Even hope became distant. Fading like a candle snuffed out in a sealed room. Imagine sitting in pitch darkness. You do not know how long you've been there. Your body aches. You can smell yourself. The air is wet and still. Somewhere above, life continues. But here, there is only the sound of your own breath and the slow, steady unraveling of your mind. That is what medieval dungeons did best. Not torture with blades, but torture with silence. With absence. With the hollow space where your senses once lived. It was said by some chroniclers that the worst dungeons were the ones where nothing happened. No beatings. No screams. Just waiting. In the dark. Until you no longer waited, because you no longer believed in time. You became part of the wall. Another shape in the stone. Another forgotten soul in a forgotten room, deep beneath the earth. That was the horror. That was the tool. No light. No air. And no hope. When we imagine medieval dungeons, we often picture hardened criminals, thieves, murderers, and traitors chained up in damp corners. But the truth is more complicated. The people who found themselves locked away in those dark chambers were not always guilty of serious crimes. In fact, many were not guilty of anything at all. The dungeon was not a place for justice. It was a place for containment. And the kinds of people it contained tell us everything about the world that built it. Let us begin with the most obvious type, the rebel. These were individuals who had risen up against a lord, a monarch, or a law. Sometimes they were armed. Sometimes they simply spoke out. In the eyes of the medieval elite, both acts were equally dangerous. Speaking truth could be seen as worse than violence, because words inspired others. And so, rebels were not just punished. They were hidden, locked away in places where their voices could no longer echo, where silence smothered their cause. But rebellion did not always wear a sword. A peasant who refused to pay taxes, a tenant who withheld crops in protest, a priest who preached without approval. These, too, were labeled as threats. Their punishment was not swift execution, but prolonged erasure, a slow descent into anonymity in the cold earth beneath a castle. There they sat, the rebellion leaking out of them like warmth from a cracked cup. Then there were the debtors. Yes, in medieval society, owing money could get you imprisoned. You didn't have to be violent or dangerous, just unfortunate. If you borrowed from the wrong person, a noble, a lender backed by the church, or even your local landlord, and couldn't repay, you might be seized. And where would they put you? Not in a courtroom. Not in a cell with rights or limits. In the dungeon. A debtor's prison without end. Ironically, there was no way to earn your way out. You couldn't work. You couldn't trade. You simply waited. Until someone, often the person you owed, decided you had suffered enough. Merchants, too, sometimes ended up behind dungeon doors. Not always for debts, but for accusations of fraud, smuggling, or price fixing. In a world without formal regulation, accusations flew fast and evidence was thin. If a rival didn't like your success, or a noble felt you were growing too powerful, they might simply have you arrested. No trial. No appeals. Just a short journey down a staircase and into the dark, where your reputation and livelihood rotted beside you. But not everyone in the dungeon was low-born. One of the most overlooked facts of medieval imprisonment is that even the noble could fall. Kings and lords used dungeons not only for peasants but for their own kind. Noble prisoners were often high stakes. They were political pawns. They were hostages in royal games of inheritance, succession, and revenge. Some were the sons of rival houses. Others were claimants to thrones. They were not always tortured, but they were kept, hidden, removed from the chessboard without bloodshed. These noble prisoners might be fed, might even have a bed of sorts. But they shared something with every other soul in the dungeon, the loss of control. The quiet. The lingering fear of abandonment. Some were ransomed back to their families. Others never left. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient. And to medieval politics, inconvenience was unforgivable. There were also religious prisoners. Heretics. Dissidents. Preachers who wandered too far from doctrine. Monks who challenged authority. These were perhaps the most tragic. Many believed deeply, spoke with conviction. But conviction in the wrong direction was a dangerous thing, especially during times of reform, inquisition, or papal conflict. For these people, the dungeon wasn't just punishment, it was purification. A space where the soul was expected to suffer, repent, or wither. And for the jailers, that was seen as justice. And finally, there were the forgotten. People who were locked up and then simply never removed. They may have been political prisoners, or witnesses to the wrong secret, or merely caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. No name on a list. No family to advocate. No champion to demand their freedom. These were the ones who truly vanished. The dungeon became their final address. Not a prison, but a grave. This variety of prisoners makes one thing painfully clear: dungeons were not about guilt. They were about power. Who had it? Who feared losing it? And who could be made to disappear in its name? In medieval times, freedom was not your right. It was your privilege. And that privilege could be taken from you by anyone holding a key. The prisoners of medieval dungeons were not all villains. Some were heroes. Some were scholars. Some were fathers, mothers, children. All of them, in the end, became the same. Silent shapes in a forgotten corridor. Waiting in the dark. Wondering not just how long they'd been there, but whether anyone remembered they had ever existed at all. Of all the miseries that haunted the depths of medieval dungeons, hunger was the most familiar. The body knows how to suffer, but it also knows how to wait. And that waiting becomes torture when the belly is hollow, when the mouth is dry, and when the hours pass with nothing to chew, nothing to drink, and no end in sight. In the darkness of the dungeon, food and water became more than needs. They became obsessions. There was no standard meal plan for prisoners in medieval times. No schedule. No guarantee of nourishment. What you received, if you received anything at all, depended entirely on who had locked you up. Some dungeons were maintained by lords, who saw starvation as part of the sentence. Others by jailers, who had their own ideas about punishment. There were no inspectors. No records. Just whims. And silence. Bread was the most common offering. But it wasn't the soft, warm bread we think of today. It was stale. Hard as wood. Sometimes days or even weeks old. Crusted with mold on the edges. Broken into chunks and thrown into the cell like feed for animals. Prisoners gnawed at it, softened it with saliva, swallowed it dry. Not for pleasure. Just to live. Just to delay the hunger for one more day. Porridge, if it was offered, was worse. Made from whatever grain was cheapest and least desirable. Barley, oats, sometimes peas ground into mush. It was served cold. Watery. Full of weevils, beetles, and grit. Sometimes it was sour. Sometimes it was green. But it was still eaten. Slowly. With trembling hands. Because you didn't know when the next bowl would come. Or if it ever would. Meat was rare. In some wealthier prisons, noble prisoners might receive scraps, sinew, fat, bone. But commoners were not so lucky. If meat appeared, it was often spoiled. Covered in flies. Crawling with maggots. Some prisoners refused to eat it. Others swallowed it with tears in their eyes, knowing full well what it meant. The line between survival and disgust was thin. And in the dungeon, disgust was a luxury. Hunger always won. Water was perhaps more precious than food. It was not brought fresh from a well or spring. Often, it came from a bucket. A single filthy bucket used for days. Dust floated on the surface. Insects danced above it. Rats drank from it before the prisoner ever did. Sometimes it was stagnant. Sometimes green. But it was all there was. If you drank it too fast, you vomited. If you didn't drink it at all, you withered. And still, no one cared. The dungeon didn't keep track. On occasion, when food was delayed or forgotten, prisoners resorted to other things. Chewing straw. Sucking on cloth. Drinking water pooled on the floor, brown, muddy, but wet. It was not uncommon for weaker prisoners to beg others to share crumbs. Sometimes they were met with kindness. Other times with teeth. In a place where nothing is guaranteed, every mouthful becomes a weapon. And starvation makes monsters of us all. There were even tales, hushed, always whispered, of cannibalism. Of prisoners driven beyond reason, gnawing at the limbs of the dead. Of guards discovering bones stripped of flesh. No one liked to speak of it, but it happened. In the longest imprisonments, where cells were shared and light never came, a man's body became both prisoner and feast. Hunger erased the line between morality and madness. Feeding routines were irregular. A guard might come once a day, or once every two. Sometimes he forgot, or chose not to. There was no appeal. No voice to ask for more. If you were lucky, a visitor might send you food. But many were forbidden visitors. Or had no one left to care. Over time, the body shrank. Muscles faded. Eyes sank deeper into the skull. You became bones wrapped in skin. And still, they brought no bread. To be hungry in a medieval dungeon was not a single moment. It was a constant state. An ache that never left. It stole your strength. It made your thoughts slow. Your prayers weak. Your memories blurred. You didn't dream of escape. You dreamed of a crust of bread. A sip of cold water. A bowl not full, just enough to cover the bottom. Just enough to make you feel like a person again. But in the dungeon, you weren't a person. You were a problem. And problems weren't fed. They were starved into silence. Into obedience. Or into death. Torture in medieval dungeons was not chaos. It was not madness, not random, screaming in shadowy corners. It was ordered. It was deliberate. And perhaps most disturbing of all, it was legal. For many centuries, across much of Europe, pain was not simply inflicted. It was sanctioned. It was documented. It was performed like a ritual. As though breaking the human body could somehow reveal the truth within it. Not every prisoner was tortured, of course. But anyone could be. The decision was often made by a local lord, a bishop, or a judge. And once made, there were few limits. Especially if the accused was thought to be a heretic, a traitor, or simply withholding information. There were no medical examinations. No psychological reviews. Just a nod. A command. And then the tools were prepared. Slowly. Carefully. The rack was among the most infamous devices. A large wooden frame with rollers at both ends. The prisoner's wrists and ankles were tied, and the rollers were turned, inch by inch. It stretched the body. Ligaments tore. Joints dislocated. Bones sometimes cracked under the pressure. There was no sudden agony, just a slow, building crescendo of pain, that left the prisoner screaming or whispering nonsense. Some confessed anything just to stop it. Others passed out, only to be revived and stretched again. Another favored tool was the thumbscrew. Small. Almost simple. A tiny vise that crushed the fingers or toes, bone against bone, slowly. It was used in early interrogations. To test a prisoner's silence. And when the cracking started, the silence usually ended. Sometimes it didn't. Some endured. But no one forgot the sound. Or the feeling. It stayed with them, long after the wounds had turned to scars. There were the iron boots, made to crush the legs. The strappado, which involved hoisting the prisoner by the arms tied behind their back, and then dropping them suddenly, tearing shoulders out of their sockets. There were collars with inward-pointing spikes. Iron gags with plates that flattened the tongue. And of course, the branding irons. Heated until glowing, then pressed to the flesh. Some left symbols. Letters. A permanent mark of guilt. Or of a confession extracted under fire. Some dungeons had a favorite, the Iron Maiden, though it's worth noting it was more of a myth in popular stories than a commonly used tool. But the idea was real enough. A coffin of spikes. Not meant to kill, but to pierce. To trap a prisoner inside a space just large enough to stand in, where every movement caused more pain. Whether or not the Iron Maiden was used often, the fear of it was enough. The stories were told in whispers. They spread further than the scream. There were other methods too, methods that needed no tools at all. Sleep deprivation. Constant noise. Forcing a prisoner to stand for days. Hanging them in cages so small they couldn't turn their head. Deprivation wasn't just about withholding food or water. It was about denying the body its peace, its comfort, its rhythms. To strip away a person's sense of self until they confessed, or lost their minds. And still, the worst part might have been the audience. Because many torture sessions were not private. They were public. witnessed by officials, scribes, even curious onlookers. It was believed that seeing the pain might encourage others to tell the truth, or to learn their place. Pain became a lesson, a performance, the dungeon a stage. And what was all of this pain supposed to achieve? Confession, names, secrets. It didn't matter whether the information was true, only that it was said. Torture wasn't about truth. It was about obedience, about control, about showing what happened to those who resisted. The louder the scream, the clearer the warning. And then the tools were put away. Quietly. Washed, if possible. Rusted, if not. The prisoner returned to their cell, or what was left of them. Bones fractured. Skin burned. Fingers twisted. But the dungeon didn't change. It remained cold. Silent. And waiting. Torture was not the exception. It was part of the process. A tool in the system. Sanctioned. Expected. And often forgotten. Until the next prisoner arrived. And the door creaked open. And the chains were tightened. And the screams began again. There is a kind of death that comes slowly. It does not arrive with a sword or a scream. It creeps in. Quietly. Through the skin. Through the lungs. Through every wound that will not close. In the medieval dungeon, disease was not just a possibility. It was a certainty. A guarantee sealed in stone and silence. A sentence that came not from the judge, but from the air, the filth, and the bodies pressed too close. These dungeons were not cleaned. They were not washed, or scrubbed or aired out. The floor was dirt or rough stone. Covered in human waste. Layers of it. Thick, slick, and sticky. Rats crawled freely over everything. Lice and fleas nested in every blanket, every garment, every patch of hair. The walls dripped. With water, yes, but also with the breath of a dozen sick men. There was no drainage. No sanitation. Just a place where infection grew bold. Where it sank into the skin and stayed. And so the prisoners began to rot. Not in a metaphorical way, but literally. Skin ulcerated. Sores opened and refused to heal. Cuts became infected. Wounds oozed. The smell was constant. Of blood. Of decay. Of the human body breaking down in real time. And there was no medicine. No bandages. No one came with herbs or healing hands. If you got sick, you stayed sick. Until your breathing stopped. The diseases varied. Dysentery was perhaps the most common. A horrible affliction, where the body loses its fluids faster than it can replenish them. The afflicted grew weaker by the hour. They curled into corners. Shaking. Delirious. Until they died in their own filth. Next to others who could not move far enough away. The disease did not pause out of pity. It simply moved on. Tuberculosis was another silent killer. Passed through the air, from one cough to another. A prisoner might begin with a scratchy throat. Then a light cough. Then blood. And after that, the lungs simply filled. With fluid. With rot. With the slow smothering that took days, not hours. By the time the others noticed, it was too late. And the infection was already in the air. Floating between bars. Hanging above heads. Waiting for a breath. And then there were the greedy ones. The jailers who turned the dungeon into a business. Want an extra blanket? That would cost you. Want to send a message to your family? There's a fee. Want food that won't make you sick? Pay up. If you couldn't pay, you suffered. If you could, you survived a little longer. Coins did what prayers could not. They softened beds. Opened doors. Even made punishments disappear. Corruption was everywhere. Some jailers accepted bribes from outside. Family members slipping them coin to improve conditions. Or to smuggle in food, wine, or letters. In wealthier prisons, some inmates paid for better rooms. Bigger cells. Privileges. For those with no money, there was only dust and dark. The dungeon had its own economy, and the jailers were its bankers. Some were worse still. They sold names, offered confessions to officials in exchange for reward, lied about what prisoners said, or didn't say. They turned one prisoner against another, encouraged betrayals, then punished both sides. It was a game, and no one won. Still, not all jailers were monsters. Some tried to be decent, quiet men, worn down by the system. They brought extra water when they could, whispered kind words to the dying, looked the other way when a prisoner stole a crust of bread. But even they were few and powerless. The dungeon did not reward kindness. It swallowed it. Over time, jailers became part of the dungeon, as forgotten as the stones, as cold. They developed a language of silence, nods, grunts, keys jingling in slow rhythm. They saw too much to care, or cared too much to survive. Either way, they faded. Like the light, like the hope. The prisoners feared the jailers, but they also depended on them. A paradox as old as the cells themselves. The man with the keys could starve you, or save you, could forget you, or speak your name in court. The jailer was not just the gatekeeper. He was the weather of your world. Calm one day, violent the next, and the storm never passed. In the end, no one was truly free inside the dungeon. Not even the men who held the keys. Not every prisoner in a medieval dungeon was sentenced. Not every name was written down. Not every voice was remembered. And over time, many simply disappeared, not in some grand escape, not through execution, but through silence, through dust, through forgetting. Some were arrested without proper charge. A political rival, a traveler who looked suspicious, a man who owed the wrong noble money, a woman accused of sorcery by frightened neighbors. They were taken in the night or in the middle of the market, shackled, dragged away, and placed inside the dungeon without formal process. Their names never entered the official records. No trial followed. No one came for them. For these forgotten souls, time had no meaning. They waited for word, for footsteps that never came, for a name to be called that no one remembered. Some scratched their names into the stone. Others left carvings of animals, shapes, prayers, desperate attempts to be remembered, even by the walls. But the walls never spoke. They absorbed everything. Hope, identity, even memory. Prisoners died in these cells and were not recorded. Their bones left to rot beneath others. Sometimes buried, sometimes not. They became part of the dungeon's structure, remains layered into its foundation. No gravestones, no prayers, no one to mourn them. They were swallowed by the place, as though they had never existed at all. What's perhaps most chilling is that sometimes even families didn't know where a prisoner had gone. Word of arrest might never reach them, or it came months too late. By then, the trail was cold. The officials had changed. The records had been lost or never made. A son, a father, a daughter, gone, as if plucked from the earth and placed in some invisible shadow, where no light could reach. Some prisoners lost even their own memories. Starved, sleepless, surrounded by despair, they forgot where they were from, forgot how old they were, forgot their own language. Their name became a whisper they couldn't catch. Their past a blank wall. They were not tortured or killed. They were erased. Slowly. Completely. Sometimes, new jailers arrived and didn't even know who was in the lower cells. They didn't ask. They didn't open the doors. A man might still be alive in the shadows, clinging to life out of habit. And the man with the keys might never find him. Or worse, might know, and simply not care. The dungeon had no census, no schedule, only the flicker of torchlight and the dull rhythm of rot. There are records from later centuries, when dungeons were being cleared or restructured, where skeletal remains were discovered in sealed cells. Doors had been bricked over, forgotten. Entire chambers missed. Bones curled in corners. Some clutching rusted chains. Others lying beside tiny carvings, initials scraped into stone, or pieces of fabric still clinging to a ribcage. The prisoners had not been buried. They had been left. Undisturbed. Unnamed. Even today, their stories are incomplete. Historians can guess. They can examine bones, measure chains, read partial names. But the truth is simple: these people vanished. Not because they ran. Not because they died in war or plague. But because someone put them in a room, closed the door, and never opened it again. They are not listed in any roll of martyrs. They were not tried or judged. They didn't even get the dignity of guilt. They simply became part of the stone. Their final breath unheard. Their final thoughts tangled in a language long forgotten. Their bones waiting in the dark. Waiting still. In the medieval world, justice was rarely a clean affair. It was messy, arbitrary, and sometimes, terrifyingly, it was merely a question of who could endure the longest. Dungeons were not just places to hold the guilty. They were places that created guilt, shaped it, proved it through suffering, or crushed it into silence. In theory, a dungeon was a place of waiting. You were kept there before your trial, before your sentencing. But that was the official story. In reality, many were held for months, years, indefinitely. The trial, if it ever came, was more of a formality. The real punishment had already happened. In the dark, in the cold, in the filth. What emerged from the dungeon was not a man, but a ghost of one. Sick, starved, scared, eyes sunken, mind broken. And this ghost, now summoned before a judge, was expected to speak clearly, to defend himself, to recall details from a year past. But memory was fog, language was rust, and strength had long since been buried. So often, prisoners confessed, not because they were guilty, but because they wanted it to end. They said what the guards wanted, what the clerks needed, what the judges expected. A name, a place, an admission, anything to escape the cell. Even if the escape was through the gallows. At least it was out. At least it was light. Even the legal system admitted its own contradictions. There are written accounts of judges expressing doubt. Doubt in the evidence. Doubt in the confessions. Doubt in the system. But by then, it was too late. The prisoner had confessed. The guards had beaten him. The dungeon had made him into the very thing they accused him of being: broken, quiet, guilty by survival alone. There were no appeals, no lawyers. The process was swift, if it moved at all. And in the slow grind of time, the dungeon remained ever patient. It didn't need justice. It didn't need verdicts. It simply waited, swallowing lives, digesting them, and spitting them out, changed, or not at all. For many, the dungeon was not a part of justice. It was the justice. No verdict was needed. Survival became guilt. Weakness became confession. And silence became evidence. The system worked not by proving guilt, but by wearing down the soul until nothing was left to prove. So when people spoke of someone being sent to the dungeon, it wasn't just a sentence of time. It was a sentence of identity, of dignity, of memory. The dungeon didn't care who you were before. When it was done with you, it decided who you were after. And often, you never came back the same. Beneath the great stone castles of medieval Europe, those towering fortresses that once housed lords, ladies, and feasting halls, there were other spaces, darker ones, tucked beneath the foundations. These were not grand halls or noble chambers. They were hidden recesses, forgotten corners. And inside them were dungeons. Real ones. wet, low, and silent. Not all castles had these secret prisons, but many did, especially those located in troubled regions or belonging to particularly paranoid rulers. These weren't the bustling gales of a city. These were personal, custom-built to punish enemies, traitors, or simply those who displeased their masters. Some were so cleverly hidden that guests above would dine, or sleep without knowing a man screamed beneath their feet. These castle dungeons were carved into bedrock, or constructed of thick stone, sometimes beneath the keep itself, sometimes under the curtain wall or towers. Access came only by narrow stairs, trapdoors, or concealed passageways. The fewer people who knew about them, the better. Some were only accessible by lowering a prisoner through a hole in the ceiling, and retrieving them the same way. If they were ever retrieved at all, conditions were no better than public prisons, and often worse. These cells were darker, colder, less ventilated, forgotten in all ways. Lords didn't want their secrets to walk free. These dungeons weren't made for temporary holding. They were made for silence. For a rasher, a noble might imprison a political rival beneath his own home. A spy, a rebellious servant, or perhaps a relative. The reasons varied, and so did the time spent down there. Some spent mere days, others, years. The walls offered no clocks. The floor had no seasons. A prisoner might hear the footsteps above but never see another face. In some places, the dungeon doubled as a personal torture chamber. The Lord didn't need legal cause. He only needed suspicion. In one French castle, a prisoner was left to rot in an oubliette, a forgotten place, a cell shaped like a bottle, deep and narrow. The man was lowered in and left. No way to climb out. No way to sit. A pit for the body. A void for the mind. There were no jailers, in the traditional sense. Often, it was just a single trusted guard. Or the Lord himself. He gave the orders. He decided when to feed the prisoner, or whether to at all. In such places, the dungeon became a reflection of the Lord's personality. If he was cruel, the dungeon was merciless. If he was paranoid, the cells were full. And if he forgot, or grew bored, the prisoner simply vanished beneath his own castle, buried in the silence. Castles that still stand today occasionally reveal their secrets. During renovations or archaeological digs, hidden chambers are found. Some sealed. Some bearing scratch marks. Chains still bolted to the wall. Sometimes even bones, curled in corners or huddled beneath a collapsed lintel. Testimony not of war, but of cruelty in peacetime. Of power unopposed. And above, history marched on. The Lord died. The family moved away. The castle changed hands. Guests admired the tapestries, laughed in the hall, and no one knew, or chose to remember, the voice that once echoed beneath the stones. Even today, if you visit one of these castles, you might walk across a flagstone floor, and not realize that someone once screamed beneath your feet. Or whispered. Or prayed. Not loudly, but endlessly, until they were part of the castle itself. Forgotten, but not gone. There is a word in Old French that carries more fear than most. A quiet word. An elegant word. Oubliette. It means, quite literally, a place to forget. But in the world of medieval dungeons, it meant something far worse. It meant a place where a person could vanish. Not with drama. Not with violence. But slowly. Completely. Until even they no longer remembered who they were. The oubliette was not a cell in the normal sense. It was a shaft. A vertical hole in the stone floor, sometimes narrow, sometimes just wide enough for a body to slump in. A prisoner was dropped through a trapdoor, feet first. There was no ladder. No rope. No door. Just the slick stone sides and the emptiness below. Once inside, there was no standing room. No walking space. You could crouch. You could curl. Or you could lie in the filth. The floor was wet. sometimes filled with old straw, sometimes bones. Always darkness, total and absolute. Even the torchlight from above barely reached the bottom. It was a grave you were still breathing in. Food, if given, was lowered in a bucket. Water too. But not always. Sometimes the oubliette wasn't meant for prolonged punishment. It was meant as execution by neglect. No need for gallows. No need for a sword. Just time. And silence. And forgetting. The prisoner would scream, at first. Loudly. Wildly. Their voice echoing up the walls. Then they would beg. Then they would bargain. And then, eventually, they would stop speaking altogether. Not because they had been silenced, but because they had run out of things to say. No one listened. And after enough time, they forgot what words were even for. You couldn't see the sky. You couldn't smell the seasons. Even in other dungeon cells, a prisoner might hear footsteps, or voices, or distant bells. But not in an oubliette. The design was deliberate. It removed the world. And in doing so, it removed the self. No identity. No time. No sense. Some oubliettes were sealed with stone once the prisoner was inside. Permanently. A small stone plug. A forgotten corner of a forgotten castle. In some cases, later generations rediscovered them centuries later. And found what remained. Bones. Rags. Claw marks. No name. No record. Just a pit where someone had once existed. One chronicler wrote of a prisoner kept in an oubliette for over a year. When he was finally pulled out, he had forgotten how to speak. His skin was pale as candle wax. His nails grown into curls. His eyes wide and blank. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply stared. As if he was still inside. Still at the bottom of the pit. As though the oubliette had never let him go. It was punishment beyond pain. It was punishment beyond death. It was the removal of identity. Of language. Of memory. That's what made it so terrifying. You weren't killed. You were unmade. And those who designed them. They thought of everything. Some oubliettes were built with slipped walls, making escape impossible even if the prisoner tried to climb. Some had slits only large enough to slide down scraps of food. Some were too narrow to lie down in. Others were so deep that even the sound of your own breathing echoed faintly back, reminding you that you were alone. And above, life went on. Nobles danced. Meals were served. Stories were told by fair light. While beneath their feet, a human being lay in the dark, becoming less human by the hour. It is easy to think of dungeons as relics of a barbaric past. But the oubliette was something worse than barbaric. It was calculated. Clinical. Designed not to punish the body, but to erase the soul. And the most chilling thing of all. Some oubliettes still exist. Sealed. Undisturbed. Silent. Perhaps still whispering, in their own way, from beneath centuries of stone. In the medieval world, religion was everywhere. It shaped the rising of the sun, the tolling of bells, the rhythm of the seasons. But it also shaped punishment, forgiveness, and fear. The dungeon, in all its damp horror, was not merely a tool of kings or constables. It was, in many minds, a reflection of divine justice. A place where sin could be answered with pain. Where confession could be forced. Where the body could be made to suffer so that the soul might be saved. Many saw imprisonment as a form of penance. If you had sinned, truly, deeply sinned, then pain was the way to redemption. The darkness of the cell was like the darkness of the soul. Cold, clinging, inescapable. Just as prayer could lead to salvation, suffering could lead to purification. That was the belief. And many believed it wholeheartedly. Monasteries and churches, too, had dungeons. Cloisters of peace above. Cells of silence below. Monks who had broken vows. Pilgrims who had strayed from the path. Even those accused of heresy, questioning the church, doubting the saints. reading the wrong scriptures, might find themselves lowered into a holy dungeon, not to be punished by men, but to be corrected by God. And then there were the confessions. The church believed that a soul must confess its sins before it could be saved. But sometimes, those confessions were not freely given. They were extracted, under pressure, through hunger, through fear. A man might admit to anything if it meant the door would open. And those admissions, often whispered through cracked lips in the dark, became eternal labels. Heretic, blasphemer, witch. Priests were sometimes sent to visit the dungeons. They brought candles, holy water, psalms. And yet, even they could not chase away the stench, the damp, the sound of coughing and weeping. The priest might offer last rites, or urge repentance. But what he rarely brought was mercy. The dungeon was not about mercy. It was about lessons, and fear, and obedience. Some even thought of the dungeon as a taste of purgatory, or worse, of hell. The darkness, the endless time, the moaning of souls around you. All of it mirrored the church's descriptions of divine punishment. Eternal, inescapable, unjust perhaps, but necessary. Inquisitions added a whole new dimension. Now, the church itself held the keys. The accused weren't criminals in the traditional sense, they were spiritual threats. The enemy within. And their punishment was not just imprisonment, but interrogation. Records describe heretics being kept in solitary cells until they lost their minds, being fed nothing but moldy bread and water, being forced to listen to hymns while chained to the wall, as if song could replace the sunlight. In this way, the dungeon became a tool of spiritual warfare, a battle not of steel, but of will. The body would suffer, but the soul, oh, the soul, that was the real battlefield. If the prisoner repented, all might be forgiven. But if not, their soul would be damned, and the cell would remain sealed. And yet, for all its divine purpose, the dungeon was still a place of earthly suffering. Rats didn't care about salvation. Hunger didn't pause for prayer. A cell could be holy in name, but profane in every stone. And many died in such places, believing not that they were being purified, but that they had been abandoned, by man, and by God. The lines between justice and penance blurred, between punishment and purification, between law and faith. The dungeon stood at the crossroads, a place where the sins of the world were judged, not in heaven, but beneath the earth. And often, those judgments had little to do with truth, and everything to do with control. So when the faithful spoke of divine punishment, of eternal flames and endless torment, they didn't have to imagine. They had already seen it, heard it, smelled it, right beneath their feet. Close your eyes, and picture a dungeon. What do you see? A stone corridor, iron bars, chains hanging from moss-covered walls, a flickering torch, and a distant, echoing drip of water. These images are so common, so vivid, that they seem almost universal. Stories, fairy tales, legends. They have taken these real places, and shaped them into something half-remembered, half-invented, but always unsettling, always cold. The medieval dungeon has become more than a historical reality. It is a symbol of cruelty, of silence, of power unchecked. In stories, it is the place where heroes are held and villains hide. In games and films, it is often where the journey begins, or where it ends in despair. But unlike dragons or sorcerers, the dungeon was real, painfully real. And yet we romanticize it. We think of hidden cells beneath Gothic towers, of cloaked jailers with keys that jingle, of prisoners whispering secrets to rats. It has become a setting, a mood. We almost forget what it truly was. A place of suffering, of despair, of forgotten lives, and forgotten names. Museums now display dungeon chambers. You can walk through them, peer into their corners, examine the rusted chains and feel a chill. But the true horror is not in what you see. It's in what you don't. The silence. The long waits. The slow erosion of hope, hour by hour, in the damp dark. The knowledge that no one is coming. The dungeon reminds us of something deeply human, the fear of being forgotten. Of being buried alive, not in soil, but in time. Of being punished not with fire, but with silence. And in that silence, slowly ceasing to exist. Even today, the word lingers in our language. Throw him in the dungeon, we say, with a smile. As if it's a joke. As if we've forgotten what that meant. We use it in children's stories and board games. It has become a symbol. But one worn smooth by time. Polished. Detached. But beneath the stories, the reality remains. The dungeons were not places of high drama. They were places of long decay. Places where nothing happened. And yet everything was lost. Names. Faces. Memories. In castle tours, you may find graffiti etched into the stone by long dead prisoners. A tally of days. A scratched cross. A carved face. Someone, long ago, fighting to be remembered. That they were here. That they were real. That they existed, even if the world moved on. And in that way, the dungeon still speaks. Not through the walls, but through the absences. Through the missing names. Through the lives ended not with a sword, but with time. We carry their stories now. Sometimes knowingly. Sometimes not. So the next time you hear the word dungeon, don't just think of darkness. Think of silence. Think of the slow passing of forgotten hours. Think of the man who carved his name into stone with a broken spoon. The woman who whispered prayers into a crack in the wall. The child who sang softly to keep the fear away. And remember them. Not just as characters. Not just as echoes. But as people. Real ones. Whose stories may have ended in the dark. But whose echoes still reach us. Even now. It begins in the dark. A place beneath the earth, beneath the stone, beneath memory itself. The dungeon waits where no footsteps echo, where no candle burns long, where time has curled in on itself, like a sleeping creature, still breathing but barely felt. And as the hours pass, not counted in minutes or bells or chimes, but in the slow dripping of water, from ceiling to floor, it is here that the mind starts to stretch and fade, caught between thought and forgetting. Stone walls press close. Not violently. Not suddenly. But with the gentle pressure of centuries. Cold seeps in, not like a wind but like a memory of wind, an echo of something, that once stirred leaves or cloaks or banners far above, and far away. You might imagine the castle overhead, with its torchlit halls and long wooden tables, and the clatter of boots on flagstones. You might hear them, faintly, as if underwater, as if remembered from a dream, but those sounds never reach down here, not fully. What reaches you instead is silence, long and wide and without end, and the realization that silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something older than noise. The dungeon does not speak, but it remembers. It remembers everyone who ever sat against its walls, curled into its corners, whispered prayers or names or apologies into its damp, rough surfaces. It remembers the hope that faded, the anger that cooled, the boredom that turned into madness. Because madness does not arrive all at once. It tiptoes. It stretches. It waits, just like the dungeon itself. And in that waiting, a prisoner begins to forget how long they have been there. Days pass. Or they don't. You lose count. Meals come, or they don't. Light slips through cracks in the stone, or perhaps it never did. You remember the sky, vaguely. Blue, wasn't it? Or gray. There were clouds once, and birds, and the sound of trees. But the dungeon is a place where the world is narrowed down to sensations. Hunger, then thirst, then pain, and after that, stillness. The stillness of limbs unused, of breath slowed, of thought softened. You listen to the breathing of the person across from you, if there is one. Maybe there was. Maybe not. The cell is too dark to tell, and your voice too tired to ask. Words feel like distant things, like tools you once used, but have forgotten the names of. You feel your hands, they're still there, but they don't do anything. They rest in your lap. They twitch sometimes when the cold sinks in too deeply. And then your mind begins to walk. It walks through memories like empty rooms, past doors that no longer open, past faces that no longer smile. You remember a laugh, but not who it belonged to. You remember light on water, but not where. The dungeon is still around you, but now it has entered your thoughts, building tiny rooms there too, without windows. And still the dripping continues. You don't know where the water comes from. You stop wondering. The stone beneath you is worn smooth beneath your weight. Your back aches. You shift then settle. You used to count your breaths, but that became tiring. So now you just breathe. In. Out. Softly. Softly. Somewhere above, someone laughs. Or maybe it's just a trick of your mind, a leftover sound from the days before the cell. You remember how doors used to open and close with ease. How you walked freely. How time passed without thought. But now time is a fog. A slow cloud that never moves. You think about names. Your own. Others. They feel worn now, like clothes that don't quite fit. You say your name to yourself. Or you try. But it feels like someone else's. You say it again. This time it sounds right. Almost. The dungeon listens. It always listens. Its silence is not empty. It is full of the past. It holds all the sounds that were ever made here. All the voices that whispered and cried and sang, and eventually went quiet. You are not the first. You are not the last. This place does not care about beginning or ending. It only cares about staying. Staying dark. Staying cold. Staying forgotten. The world above continues. You know that. Somewhere, a market bell rings. A child runs. A loaf of bread is pulled from an oven. But those things feel like myths. Like songs from childhood. You sit. You wait. You blink slowly, though there is nothing to see. And in the distance, no louder than a memory, you hear footsteps. They might be real. Or not. But for a moment, your heart stirs. You remember what it was like to be seen. To be spoken to. To be called by name. But the steps fade. And the silence returns. Not cruelly. Not loudly. But fully. And you close your eyes again, not because you're tired, but because there's nothing left to open them for. The dungeon breathes around you, slow and deep. And you begin to dream, not of escape, but of stillness. Of soft earth and gentle winds and warm places long forgotten. The dungeon does not mind. It has seen countless dreams drift in and out of its walls. It holds them. Like mist. Like dust. Like memory. You breathe in. You breathe out. And everything slows. Softens. Fades.